All right, so today let's look into something pretty interesting. I think, um, we always hear about moving abroad to save money and
Yeah.
stuff. And today we're going to go a little deeper, I think, with this whole idea of being an expat, specifically according to this company, Expat Money.
Okay.
And we're looking at their About Us page today.
hmm
But it's more than just a bio for the company. It's like their whole philosophy.
Yeah. What I thought was really interesting is how they present themselves as like a movement. They don't say
Right.
we're just consultants or advisors. It's like they're aiming for a whole lifestyle change, not just, moving to a new country.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not just about finding some tax haven and calling it a day.
Right.
They really seem to be focusing on building community and connecting people with shared values. So, they could be into location independence or just into travel or just a certain outlook on life. But it seems like a big part of it is that connection.
Yeah, and that's smart because I think a lot of people, when they think about moving abroad, one of the first things they think about is like, won't I be isolated? Won't I be alone?
Totally. Yeah.
And they're addressing that right up front.
Yeah. And so to kind of like drive this whole idea home, they present their founder, Mikkel Thorup, as like the ultimate expat, right?
Right.
Over 110 countries visited, 9 that he's called home. He dropped out of school at 15. So it's like they're projecting a very particular image, I think.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely going to appeal to a certain type of person.
Yeah.
Someone who maybe feels stifled by tradition, someone who wants to do things different.
Right. Someone who's looking to break the mold.
Exactly.
Yeah. But it also, I think, raises a question like, does his very specific experience actually translate to everyone?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, not everyone can or even wants to live as unconventionally as this guy,
Right.
and while it definitely gives him some credibility having actually lived this life that he's promoting, um, I think we should also be a little cautious.
Yeah.
Even the title of his book, Expat Secrets: How to Pay Zero Taxes.
Oh, yeah.
These kinds of claims always need a closer look. Tax laws are complicated.
Yeah, definitely.
What works for one person might not work for someone else and could even get them into trouble.
Absolutely. So I think it's good to look deeper into some of these things. And one place I think we can start with that is with these core values that Expat Money emphasizes.
Okay.
Because this is really, I think, where we get to the heart of their philosophy. So the first one is stellar reputation,
Mm-hmm.
which seems to be aimed at reassuring people that they're dealing with a trustworthy organization. But how can they actually ensure that across a global network?
Right? That's where the potential downsides come in.
Yeah.
Relying solely on a company's claims, especially when you're making a major life decision like moving to another country,
Mm-hmm.
it can be risky. It's kind of like choosing a restaurant based only on their own best burger in town sign.
Right.
You need to get multiple perspectives.
Yeah, you want to see those reviews.
Exactly.
Yeah, good analogy. So it sounds like even when a company is presenting itself as ethical, it's healthy to be a little skeptical.
For sure.
Okay, and then there's community, which we already touched on, but they also list inspiring others as a value, which I think creates a really interesting dynamic.
Yeah.
So are they trying to build a support system, or is there kind of an element of like, look how great my life is, you should do this too,
Yeah, it's a fine line, isn't it?
Yeah.
On the one hand, that sense of community can be incredibly powerful for expats.
Especially when they're feeling isolated.
Exactly, but it can also lead to kind of an echo chamber where you're only hearing from people who agree with you and, maybe reinforcing potentially biased views.
Right.
So it's great to be inspired, but you got to keep your critical thinking hat on, especially when you're navigating a new culture and a whole new set of rules.
For sure, which actually connects perfectly to their next value, which is personal responsibility.
Right.
They're basically saying you are in charge of your own experience, which fits with that whole self-reliant image they're creating. But could this also lead to people feeling overwhelmed or even blaming themselves if things go wrong?
Oh, absolutely. They have a balance to be struck. Personal responsibility is empowering, but it shouldn't mean that you can never ask for help or that you should ignore any systemic factors that might be impacting your experience.
Right, and it's hard to know, how much of that is going on behind the scenes.
Yeah.
This is getting really nuanced, which I love because, it's not just all sunshine and sangria. There's some real depth to this decision.
Mm-hmm.
And their focus on personal growth, I think, really ties in here because it's not just about moving to a new location.
Right.
It's about making an internal change. But how much of that is genuine self-discovery versus this pressure to constantly optimize your life, which seems to be a common theme in these circles.
Yeah, and that ties into the idea of discussing important ideas and providing cutting-edge content, which are a couple more of their values.
Right.
So is it about genuine intellectual curiosity, or is there a subtle pressure to constantly consume information, even a fear of missing out on the next big thing in the expat world?
Okay, so it seems like we're seeing a pattern here. There are these good intentions, but also potential pitfalls.
Yeah,
Like any life philosophy, it needs to be examined critically, not just accepted at face value.
exactly.
So what about their emphasis on honesty and ethics? I mean, that seems pretty straightforward, but how can they really guarantee that across a global network of individuals and businesses?
It's aspirational for sure, and probably a key part of how they brand themselves.
Hmm.
But actually enforcing ethical behavior across borders is incredibly challenging?
Right. It's not like there's some global ethics police.
Right. It's more about setting a tone, attracting like-minded individuals,
Right.
rather than having some foolproof system.
Okay, so it's more about building a culture of ethical behavior.
Exactly.
This is why we're doing this deep dive, right? We're going beyond the surface and really thinking critically about this whole thing.
Yeah.
And it's almost ironic that their final value is critical thinking. Given everything we're discussing,
Right.
are they encouraging it genuinely, or is it more about applying critical thinking within their framework of what they consider a successful expat life?
It's a good question.
Yeah.
It could be a little of both. They clearly want people to be informed and make their own choices,
Yeah.
but they also have a vested interest in promoting their specific vision of expat life. So I think it's up to the individual to figure out where those lines get blurry.
So we've got this tension, right?
Yeah.
They're promoting personal responsibility while also offering this structured community and philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
So before we move on to talk about some other aspects of expat money, what's your initial reaction to all of this?
I'm really struck by how carefully they've crafted their image. It's appealing,
Yeah.
but as with anything, there are layers beneath the surface. And I think it's a good reminder that we should approach these kinds of movements with, both enthusiasm
Yeah.
and a healthy dose of skepticism.
I totally agree. They're clearly tapping into this desire that people have for something more than the traditional 9 to 5. But it's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Right.
It requires careful consideration and, like they say, critical thinking.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's kind of like they're giving you a map, but it's up to you to choose your route and your destination.
Right.
And speaking of maps, let's talk about their Expat International School initiative,
Okay.
focusing on alternative education. I thought that was fascinating, especially for families who are thinking about this lifestyle.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder what gaps they see in traditional schooling
Right.
that are particularly relevant for expat kids. Is it just about, like, adapting to different curriculums as they move around, or is there something deeper going on, like a philosophical difference?
Yeah, it's probably both. I mean, logistically, a more flexible, maybe online-based approach makes sense when you're moving around a lot.
Mhm.
But remember, Thorup himself is a school dropout.
Oh, right.
So that might suggest that he's a little skeptical of conventional education systems. Maybe he wants to empower kids to learn differently.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it that way.
Yeah,
But it adds another layer to that personal responsibility thing, doesn't it?
exactly.
Are they equipping kids to make their own choices within existing systems, or are they encouraging them to completely go their own way?
That's a big question for parents to think about.
Yeah.
It's one thing to apply that philosophy to your own life, but it's another thing entirely when you're talking about your kids' education.
Yeah, and this is where I think the whole community aspect gets really interesting. Are they creating this, like, self-sustaining ecosystem where kids grow up with a very specific worldview? Or is there room for different perspectives?
Yeah, hard to say without really getting into the details of their curriculum and how their community actually functions.
Right.
But it's worth noting that they're not just making things easier for expat families logistically.
Mhm.
It seems like they're actually trying to mold the next generation of expats.
Okay, so we've got this movement. It's not just about location. It's about education and values and even shaping a certain type of future.
Right.
And then you've got Thurup's involvement with this Ugandan charity that supports teen mothers.
Right.
I mean, that seems to add a whole other dimension to this whole thing.
It does, doesn't it? On the one hand, it's kind of humanizing. It shows that he's not just all about profits and personal gain.
Yeah.
But it also makes you wonder, are there any conflicting ideologies within the expat money community?
What do you mean?
Well, think about it. That whole personal responsibility thing could clash with the realities that these young mothers are facing.
Yeah.
Their situations are often the result of poverty and lack of access to resources, things that are totally outside of their control.
Okay, so are they acknowledging those complexities, or is it more of like a bootstrap mentality? Just pull yourself up by your bootstraps regardless of your circumstances.
It's tough to say. I mean, it's possible that Thorup genuinely wants to empower these women, but it's also possible that he doesn't fully grasp the nuances of the challenges they're up against.
This deep dive is really showing how even philosophies that seem positive on the surface can have these blind spots.
Right. It's not about like tearing them down or anything. It's about understanding the full picture.
Exactly. As we start to wrap things up, is there anything else about expat money that's standing out to you?
Well, I think they've definitely tapped into this growing desire that people have for alternatives,
Alternative to like,
to the traditional 9 to 5, to the traditional education system, even to traditional community structures. But I think it's important to remember that alternative doesn't always mean better.
right.
It's about asking those tough questions, doing your research, and deciding if this really aligns with your values, not just your desire for something different.
Yeah, that's a great takeaway. And I think that applies to any big life decision.
For sure.
Whether it's moving abroad, changing careers, even just choosing a school for your kid.
Absolutely.
It's about being informed and intentional.
Yeah, so for our listeners out there who are maybe intrigued by this whole expat lifestyle, what do you think they should be thinking about?
Yeah, what advice would you give them?
I would say, go beyond the glossy brochures and the social media posts and think about what are the real costs involved. And I don't just mean financially. I mean emotionally, socially. How is this going to impact your relationships, your sense of identity,
Right.
And most importantly, are you really prepared to take on that level of personal responsibility that they talk about?
Even when things get tough.
Especially when things get tough, because they will.
Yeah, those are some heavy questions, but they're important.
They are.
It's easy to get caught up in the excitement of a new adventure.
Yeah.
But it's important to be realistic. It's like we've come up with this whole toolkit for evaluating any big life change,
Right.
not just expat life,
Right.
We're looking at values and potential downsides and long-term implications.
Exactly. And remember, you can apply these principles to decisions you're making right here at home. It doesn't have to be about moving abroad.
Right?
It could be choosing a school, starting a business, even just like shifting your mindset.
Mm-hmm.
All of that requires critical thinking and self-awareness.
Absolutely. Whether you're moving across the world or across town, understanding why you're doing it and what could happen is so important.
Couldn't agree more. And, don't underestimate the power of community.
Yeah.
Surrounding yourself with people who challenge you, but also support you, can make a huge difference no matter where you are.
For sure. And speaking of community, that's something we're really passionate about here at Think and Act Locally.
Absolutely.
We're all about empowering people in Deer Park, LaPorte, Pasadena, Texas, to make a difference right here in our community.
Yeah, whether it's supporting local businesses or getting involved in some kind of civic initiative or even just being a good neighbor.
Right.
It all matters.
Small actions can have a ripple effect.
They really can.
And if you like what we do here at Think and Act Locally and you want to support our mission, please consider donating. You can find a link in the show notes. It's thinkandactlocally.com/donate.
Every little bit helps.
It really does. So as we wrap up this deep dive into expat life, I think the main takeaway is that, like any journey, it's really about self-discovery. It's about asking tough questions and taking risks and being open to the unexpected.
Yeah, beautifully said. Whether you're dreaming of far-off lands or finding adventure right here at home, keep exploring, keep learning, keep building that community that supports you.
Great advice. Thanks for joining us.